Well, all of us here at God TV, here at Soul Survivor, are super stoked, excited to talk to Robby Dawkins. Wow, what a legend, man. You're like in furious love, and God has used you to do some incredible things. But this is the first time a lot of our viewers have ever seen you or heard from you, apart from the movies. And so we just want to know a little bit about your journey beforehand. So you pastor a church in Aurora, Illinois, is that right?
Yeah. I really grew up in ministry. My parents were missionaries in Japan, and we came back to the U.S. and my parents started pastoring churches. My parents always primarily pastored in like poor urban areas, and so that's kind of what I grew up in. And you know, I remember the first time I ever saw, my first sort of supernatural encounter of somebody. It was a young man who had been a prostitute, selling his body for food and drugs, just trying to survive. He'd been kicked out of his home. Dad beat him every day, type of thing. And my parents took him in to try to help him get off drugs. And I remember, just seeing the bizarre behavior out of this guy, and sickness, and everything with it. And one morning he was. He had his arm up on the windowsill, and he's looking out the window. It was early in the morning, and I said his name, and he turned and looked at me, and I was afraid because he had been like, I'd see him run into the toilet and vomiting, and just in the sickness from heroin and stuff like that. And he turned and he looked at me, and front of his shirt was wet. He had tears streaming down his face, and I looked at him and I said, "What's going on?" And he said. He told me, he goes, I just woke up this morning and said, who would want somebody like me? And he said, Jesus appeared in the room, and he said, I'll take you. And he said, I could feel him. He said, he took me in his arms. I could feel him. I could smell him. He said, and he just rocked me. And he said, he looked at me and he goes, Robby, he took all the shame, the sin, the past, the agony, the addiction. He just took it all away. All of it just melted away as he just held me and kind of rocked me. And he just said, it's gone, and he dropped his head and started crying. I jumped up and I ran to my parents' bedroom, and I sort of burst in their room, and it's just like early on a Saturday morning. And my dad jumps up and he's like, what did he do? And I just said, nothing. I said, my dad, he was worried that something inappropriate had happened. Sure. I was freaked out. I said, no, he didn't do anything. And then I told him what happened, and I started crying, and I said, that's what I want to see the rest of my life. I said, I want to see Jesus do that in people. And I was 9 years old. Yeah, and that made a major impact on me. And I just said, I remember telling my parents, and my parents remember, me saying, that's what I want to see the rest of my life. I want to see God do that. And so that sort of prompted, going on and planting a church in a same area, and people that have been in drugs, and people that have been involved in prostitution and all sorts of addiction and gang violence, things like that. And so, we just have a mixture. Actually, it's interesting because of Furious Love, I talk about this dream that I have. And later on, the dream kind of becomes the driving force. It's sort of the vision for the church. And it's so cool today, that we can say that we've seen that happen. We've seen that come, and even when I talk about it in Furious Love, it had not been fully fulfilled yet, but now it has. Of just seeing the lives being transformed like that.
Just give us a really quick snippet of the dream, because for some people they might not have seen it recently.
Well, it's just in this dream. I just walk into a church, and it was in a dream again, and there was all of these horrible things going on. People literally like having sex in the pews, people fighting, people doing drugs in the church, and just it was just this mayhem. And I kept trying to get it to stop. And I was like, you got to honor God's house, you got to show respect here. And then I was like, if you're not going to respect this, then you need to get out. And then the Lord spoke to me and said, you need to go. And I was like, I'm your guy. I'm the pastor here. What do you mean I gotta go? And then he just spoke to me, and he said, look, keep it simple. Love them. Let me change them. Speak the truth. Don't change that. But in the midst of all that, just love them, and watch me change them. And just things switched after that. I mean, my theological perspective, everything, all of a sudden my whole strategy for how to do ministry shifted. And just, I began to move in this, you know, just this pursuit of just radical, relentless love of God, and just, and you know, speaking the truth of Scripture, you know, not, I always say, you know, we don't sacrifice biblical truth on the altar of cultural relevance, you know, but at the same time, you know, loving them just over the top, you know, and we just saw that all of a sudden walls started breaking down in people's lives. People started being open. People started changing, you know, and you know, just things began to make a major shift. And so today, you know, what I saw happen in the dream of it sort of stirring this, you know, major shift in the city and all that, and it changing the city, you know, today that's happened. So, yeah.
Praise God. All glory to Jesus.
It is, yes.
Tell us about the police, because you were telling me a little bit yesterday. Just give us another insight into that. It's amazing.
Yeah, so, you know, in Father of Lights, which is the last movie that Darren Wilson had done, and I put this in the start of my book because everybody had started, who had seen the movie, so that they would capture that, and it's Do What Jesus Did, it is the name of the book. But at the start of it, they tell about how that they were threatening, the gangs were threatening to start a war in 2012 with the police, with rival gangs. And when we moved into Aurora, Aurora was one of the bloodiest cities in all of Chicagoland. I mean, you would literally go even in Southside Chicago and mention Aurora, and people would gasp, you know, because Aurora had such a bad reputation. As a matter of fact, the movie Wayne's World, they wouldn't film but a little bit in Aurora because of the gang violence. This is an LA film company that wouldn't come to Aurora. And so, but they were threatening because all of a sudden, you know, we have just been going out and hitting the streets, praying for people, you know, doing treasure hunts and doing just healing in the streets and ministering to people, bringing people to Christ, just going after it again and again and again, and just not stop. Everything we do, we were tying into what we call power evangelism. Yeah. And so, you know, healing, prophetic, deliverance, you know, breaking demonic power, ministry of manifest presence to bring people into a relationship with Christ. And so we have just been, for years, been hitting that again and again. Well, the crime has started dropping. And so they actually had to lay off a third of the police force in Aurora because the police were literally bored because things had just been changing. And everybody was like, what's happening? What's happening? And so 2012, you know, in what you see happen in Father of Lights, you know, we bring these top gang leaders, not just for Aurora, but for Chicago, in, and we basically, they were like, you know, threatening me as we came in. And one of these guys had threatened to kill me, you know, and we've had that happen a couple times with this. And then to see him come in, this was really sweet to watch happen, you know, because they came in and they were pointing out in our church building, like where there had been bullet holes and where they had dropped somebody. They had done a drive-by shooting and killed somebody on the front lawn of the church and all this. And basically they're threatening us, saying if you do anything that we don't like, we'll come do it again. You know, that's the way they're threatening. And so, and they were saying that 2012 would be the bloodiest year ever because they were going to get back their respect. And in gang lingo, if you fear me, you respect me. And so, so I looked at him and I said, well, why do you think we brought you here? And my friend Todd White, you know, was with me in that portion. He also had a part later on in the movie, at the end of the movie, which is epic. Yeah. And so they said, well, you know, you're trying to stop a war. And I said, no. I said, we want to introduce you to God. And they were like, we know who God is. And they're grabbing their crucifixes. They're like, we know who God is. And I said, you don't know him the way you're about to meet him. So you're about to meet God in a way you've never met him before. And one by one, we started praying for them. Every one of them were healed. This one guy, he couldn't bend his leg. One guy had a leg shorter than the other. several places where they've been popped, where they've been shot, you know, in the stomach or in the chest, where they had abdominal problems or problems in their chest as a result. They were completely healed. With one of them, the scars started disappearing. I mean, it was just amazing, the stuff that was happening right there. And one of the guys kept picking up his chair, looking under the chair, saying, there's got to be wires connected to this chair, because he kept feeling electric current going through him the whole time. And we're like, well, that's God's power, you know? And so the end of the story is they all end up giving their lives to Christ, and it was amazing. And there's a lot of back end story I could give you that's just been phenomenal. But sort of the sum up the story is in 2012 we did not have one homicide in all of Aurora. That hasn't happened for 67 years. And that you know, articles about that, what had taken place in Aurora, was in the Huffington Post, it was in the New York Times, it was in the Washington Post, it had been on CNN, and been on, they'd done a segment on the BBC, which ended up bringing, I think it was an Italian police chief, to fly to Aurora to study our police's intel, to try to figure out what's the police intelligence that's done this. And they were all, you know, saying, hey, it's not necessarily just our intelligence. You've got to look at that church and what they've been doing, because they said they've made a major impact.
And they sent them to you guys.
Yeah. And I mean, we had, you know, we had prayed for our mayor. I had a meeting with the mayor, and his leg grew out. We had some pretty dramatic, you know, encounters, and he had been prayed for him several times, and he had been healed, and just really a nominal Catholic guy. I mean, didn't have much, you know, in faith, and just one by one, you know. And so now the city is just, it's neighboring Naperville is a predominantly white upper class neighborhood. Their crime rate is now higher than Aurora's. And that has never happened in all of history. And so it's just totally what Jesus has done, and just how he has just been, you know, just transforming the city, and just, you know, impassioning us to go and do what Jesus did, you know, and just light it up, you know.
And that's the book.
Yeah, that's the title of the book, Do What Jesus Did. Basically, it's saying, don't just ask the question, do it.
Do it.
You know?
What would Jesus do?
If we just ask the question, we'll talk ourselves out of doing it.
Wow.
So just do it.
GWJD.
Yeah.
One of the themes we've been looking at with all of our people that we interview is staying the course, going the distance. And for a lot of young people especially, you know, they're attracted to the gospel, they're attracted to Jesus to begin with, but it doesn't take much. You know, the Bible tells us about the seeds. But for you, what's your best advice for going the distance, just really sticking at it and slogging it out?
Well, you know, there's obvious things like the disciplines and spending time in scripture and in prayer, and that should just be a mainstay, just that time with God, that, you know. But also, you know, having an outward focused life, you know, to where that we see that, you know, that the only Christ in us is the only hope for the world. And, you know, many times in the church, we're all praying for revival, and we should, you know. But the reality is the next great revival for where you live is probably in your seat right now. And so being that breakthrough, being that, living that out, and there's something when we don't, because so much of books and things like that get us to focus on our own spiritual development, our own spiritual growth, or taking care of our souls, which is all good things. But if it doesn't get to the mission of Jesus, and that is that you've been filled up to be poured out, you've been filled up to go. And John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard, he used to say it like this: we get to give, to get to give, to get to give. And that's how we always stay fresh, is if we receive, then we're poured out of what we received, and then we get another fresh dose to give again. And that's how it keeps it fresh. That's what keeps it cutting edge in our lives. That's what keeps it, you know. And so if we see ourselves as that, we're engaging actually, you know, in the ministry of Jesus. And Acts 2:22 says the endorsement of the Father, and then NLT it says the endorsement of the Father and the ministry of Jesus was with signs and wonders. And the cool thing about doing signs and wonders, about healings and prophetic ministry and doing these things, is that it keeps us active in a sense of purpose. It keeps us active, and that can be at any age. You know, any age group, you know, can do that. I have a 9-year-old autistic son. He prays for people all the time and sees them healed. I mean, he's literally had notes written home from the principal saying, will you please tell your son to stop praying for people for healing? And we're like, why are they not getting healed? And he goes, no, because they are getting healed. And they're like, you know, we've got atheist parents and Jehovah's Witness parents that are angry about that, you know, and so will you tell them to stop? And of course, my advice as I look at him and I'm like, what would Jesus do, son? What do you think Jesus would do? He says, well, Jesus kept healing the sick. And I'm like, then do what Jesus did, you know, then go do what Jesus did, because I said, you know, we're going to obey Jesus, right? And he's like, yeah. And of course, in the States, you know, it's if it's student led, it's completely, you know, and he always asks them, you know, would you like prayer? If they say yes, he prays for them, you know. So, but those are things that just keep it alive. And so it's not just about, you know, me, you know, sort of getting something for myself, but me being filled up to be able to be a resource for others. And that's that whole, you know, living water, you know, well that Jesus is talking about with the Samaritan woman. It'll spring up like a life spring inside of you. What he's saying is other people will come and drink from it, you know, and that keeps it alive in us. And so that's what keeps us moving and going. It's not a works-based thing, but it is it keeps life and it keeps movement happening. And so I think that's a crucial part